I don't. Yeah. I mean,
Well, you're okay.
I'm not big on ceremony.
Hello, my name is Tadas Spinnaker. Welcome to Flickr Inter-Theory Views. Today we have a guest on our show whose name is Andrew Culp. He wrote a book called Dark Deleuze. When Deleuze was referring to Bergson's philosophy, he once said that a great philosopher has the capacity to create new concepts. And he was referring to Bergson's concept of intuition, and the fact that maybe a better philosopher would be better at creating new concepts that allow rejuvenate the discussion about the philosophical issue. And I just want to quote Plato, who says that we should cut up each kind to its species along its natural joint. So in order to rejuvenate the discussion within the philosophical context, we have to, one way or another, introduce a new, better concept. And having in mind that Deleuze is very influential in all kinds of fields, in new materialism, in post-humanism, if there is a concept that rejuvenates this discussion of Deleuzian dogma and dictum, well, this book just might be it. And so I present to you Andrew Culp, who is right now he's a professor at CalArts. He teaches media history and theory in aesthetics and politics program, and he has published work on media, films, and politics and philosophy. Has appeared in Radical Philosophy and other journals as well. And so, welcome to this segment of Flickr Theory interviews. I'm very honored to meet you and talk to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. It's a wonderful day. It's nice here in sunny Southern California, though I guess a cloud or two is probably passing. Thanks for all the work that's come into preparing for this interview, and I'd like to thank Kirsty as well for helping out with the project.
Thank you, Kirsty.
And I really look forward to the conversation.
Okay, let's just begin with at the beginning, I guess. You begin in this book. You talk about the canon of joy that follows Deleuze's work, which, as you claim in this book, revolves around Deleuze's work in philosophy today. Why do such Deleuzean slogans as transversal lines, rhizomatic connections, compositionist networks, complex assemblages carry so much starry-eyed positivity with them? What do these slogans signify or intend to signify? And whether can they be actually interpreted hedonistically? And there's any kind of merit in interpreting that hedonistically?
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful question. So part of my own personal biography may explain some of this. So I came of age politically during the tail end of the anti-globalization period, which, for those who are not familiar with it, was a challenge to the global economic paradigm after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It, at the time, was often called the Washington Consensus because people around Washington, D.C. had used it as a sort of economic and policy platform that they wanted to globalize throughout the whole world. It involved things like austerity, structural adjustment programs, a lot of free trade agreements that were forcing a lot of changes in the globe, not only in the Third World, but in former Soviet and communist countries. And so, for me, I was really interested in the political dynamics at that time. I was also going on with the whole philosophical education as well. And so initially I was really interested in the work of Michel Foucault, especially as a theorist of power, and I think that that's always been with me. I think that almost every situation deserves a sort of analytic of power in order to determine what's going on. But then I also felt some limits, and some of it was he was a very deeply contextual thinker. He had a lot of things to say about the political events of his time. And this is something that people don't remember as much about him. He was actually deeply involved, even if it didn't come in through some of his historical work. He even once had his ribs broken fighting with the police. In like a rally in the late 70s, and so it was the early 80s. Anyway, so for me, I was trying to bring those things together. And so there was a time where I was riding the wave of Deleuzean scholarship as well, which, as you mentioned, I call the canon of joy. And so during the anti-globalization period, it was defined by the resurgence of autonomous Marxism, which was the idea that there is an alternative to the economic model of globalization as well as the political model of globalization, and it happened with swarms and networks, and the subject that was thought was the multitude, which had all these Spinoza sort of intonations to it. And I was with it for a while, but then as we saw the anti-globalization period really sort of turn into the war on terror and everything else, and then the economic collapse of 2008, we started seeing the emergence of other forms of political activity that I thought were really important. They started posing no demands, and that was the more interesting, militant, harder to understand version of the sort of like post-2008 movements, Occupy being one of them, but it's remembered in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. And so then, as I was really working in and through Deleuze's concepts, I myself made the sort of transition from someone who was just looking for connections everywhere, idea that horizontal networks suddenly were the answer to all of our problems, and I really started looking deeper into Deleuze's work, because there's a difficulty when you first read Deleuze, especially when he's writing the Guattari. You have just such a difficult time with the words and the nomenclature. I mean, he keeps a fairly consistent use of his concepts, but he uses a different name for him in every book across his many decades of publishing. And so it's a little difficult. So initially you just sort of mimic what he's saying. Initially you just sort of try and use the words in your own context to see if they have a lot of value or meaning. And then ultimately, once you get down to the concepts themselves and you strip away a lot of the nomenclature or a lot of the jargon, you can suddenly start thinking in it. So one place that I might go, a less traditional one, but maybe a more philosophical one, is not only through difference and repetition, but all the way through to what is philosophy. He says that the job of philosophy may or may not be the creation of concepts, but maybe another version of that, if we want to give it a different name, is to pose a problem. He says that the work of philosophy is not to come up with solutions, but it's a way of posing problems in a new way. And for him, it's a new orientation toward the world.
Yeah.
And this is part of his use of not only Bergson, but also James, in which he says we need a reason to believe in this world. So for him, it's a reorientation toward the world in order to understand it, navigate it differently. But for me, I think we're now at a point where we need to be rethinking even that. And so one of my big proposals in the book is that we've now come to the death of the world. In the same way in which Nietzsche has said that there's been the death of God, and then let's say someone like Foucault said that there was the death of man or humanity. I think we're now after the end of the world as this motivating concept. And so this is my staging ground for a lot of disputes with things like new materialism, which I think has a lot of important insights, but also gives a little too much value to certain materialism. So there are these debates within materialism about what is the world, how much weight and value should we give it, and how do we sort of navigate it. And so part of me, this is also returning to the idea of the line of flight and trying to think it new. What is the line of flight? Certainly it's not just flying off in the cosmos like Elon Musk saying we need to colonize new planets. Perhaps it's not even the line of flight of someone like Sun Ra, who doesn't like what's going on Earth so much. He feels so distanced and disidentified from it that he needs to be an alien from another planet in order to sort of figure out his place here. For me, it's about not just sort of the world already being a dead idea or a dead concept, but thinking what is actively still trying to constitute the world and to bring an end to it.
Yeah, that's perfect. So that's why it's dark, right?
Yeah.
Basically.
And you know, just to clarify really quickly, I think darkness is a difficult term, and I underdeveloped a little bit. And I have an excuse, of course. So Deleuze, in his own writing, talks about how his concepts are meant to be rigorous yet inexact. And in that, he means, okay, it has to have enough consistency. You have to be able to do significant work with it. But it's inexact in the sense that he doesn't want to define it so clearly that you're using it as a positivist term that's already done all of its work. That's part of his general sort of critique of how we think the relationship between the actual and the virtual is well. It shouldn't just be a real possible relationship. We can put that aside for a moment and say that, for me, I think that dark is also one of these rigorous yet inexact concepts. So I might be able to define it, but I'd have to define it in a whole variety of ways. And we need to make sure not to define it in some ways that are very polar opposite to what I want. So one of them would be the work of like Land, or other people who are sort of edgelords for the dark, and they think that it's about listening to a lot of the Smiths, or wearing a lot of black, which there's nothing wrong with that. But this book is not just a sort of affective tonality, but it's a larger, both intellectual and political project as well.
Sounds great. When you read this book, you're always I'm always fascinated how assertive you are. You have authority over the pen, and has this put people off? Is that the point? Does the book have to be like a manifest for you? Are you concerned about certain masculinity that is implied when you're writing a book like this? That is very sort of since we often talk about psychedelics, I'm not going to be afraid of using this term, phallic.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so this is an issue that really speaks strongly to me because I want there to be a queer feminist line that goes throughout the book, but it's a difficult one to navigate because the traditional sort of writing methods of queer feminism has often been a form of collective collaboration, and so it doesn't take criticism as its first move. And you're right. I mean, criticism is something that I find very important here, in part because I'm reacting to the sort of post-critical turn in which criticism seems to be less and less important, not just politically, but methodologically. And so I want to walk a very fine line. So I'd say some of my allies in the process, or someone like Lee Edelman, who comes from a very Lacanian framework. And so I am, indebted to his way of thinking, but in so many ways, I'm not able to incorporate very much of it in the text because it just doesn't play well with the Deleuze. But similarly, I want to be very strong with the words that I'm saying. And so, some of my initial references are the Situationist International. Apparently, and I've been trying to track this down, haven't found it yet, argued that if you can't reduce a political idea to a slogan, then it's not clear enough yet. And so for me, I want every sentence to be a slogan. Now this has some precedent as well. In Brian Masumi's translator's introduction to 1,000 Plateaus, he also talks about the role of philosophy. And he says you can either use philosophy is like a brick, he says. You can either use it to build the courthouse of reason, or to throw it through a window. So for me, this is all about throwing it through a window. So I want every sentence to sort of have a charge to it. I don't want it to get sort of mired down. And in part, that's a methodological as well as an intellectual concern. I think, and this is in part through my work as a media theorist, I think we're in an age of oversaturation. I think that we have more ideas and more information than we've had in a long time. So the difficulty that people have is not necessarily getting access to new ideas. It's about filtering through them. It's about selecting them. It's about finding something useful. And I want there to be space for people to do old scholastic research where they can read a book for 5 or 10 years. And there's a place for that. That's very much not this book. This book is meant to just really strike out and be there. So I would say maybe it's more punk rock than anything else. It's, maybe it's a little more than 3 or 4 chords. But I am not afraid of it being sort of screamed out at the top of your lungs. It's taking a very specific position. And in that way, I want the reader to be clear about sort of the position that's being taken within the context of the book.
Exactly. And I think it made me think of the criticism that Derrida gave to Levi-Strauss by saying that there's no myth. We have to allow all these voices to be included in the way we critique theory or whatever it might be. But at the same time, we cannot risk in having a sort of a murky theory that doesn't allow us to mobilize people, galvanize people, a galvanized movement. And is that the thing that it sounds like that's what you would like to do? You would thrust people into some sort of antagonism and allow them to think more critically of
And there's a concept that I've been trying to work through for a long time, and is there antagonism within Deleuze? And this is a huge question. So, and this initially came when I was working with someone on my dissertation committee 10 years ago on who was a negriist.
Yeah.
So negri is very unclear on the concept of antagonism, right? Is it that, living labor has been the subject of history all along, and suddenly they just need to get capitalism off its back, and so there's no antagonistic relationship necessary. It's just one of exodus, right? Or, there are these sort of like ultra-Leninist moments of negri as well, where, you're just like in a pitched battle in the streets. So for me, I was like, okay, is there antagonism here? And I kept looking around, and, for some people, it's not. They don't want it, right? And strangely enough, some of that comes through democracy theorists. So some of them very strongly believe in the agon, and so it's an already constituted group of people who have fights and their conflicts, but it's mostly about coalition building and kind of sometimes majority wins, though you have to build in some procedural mechanisms to stave it off. I mean, I get to that stuff and my eyes just glaze over. I'm not working in that democratic tradition because I've done too much on the ground politics to have very much faith in that. As a political subject and political being, I've been to city councils, I've been to hearings, I've been to EPA hearings on things. And you know what? That's not democracy. If that's democracy, that's terrible, right? So I want antagonism, class antagonism, anti-capitalist antagonism, queer antagonism, all these things, I think Queer Bash Back, the Queer Group Bash Back is a huge influence over how I sort of think here. And so part of this project was to find out how to rehabilitate moments of antagonism that I thought were in Deleuze, but in ways that were ultimately kind of faithful to his metaphysics. So it wouldn't just be trying to sneak Hegel in through the back door or something. It was really figuring out, what is the formal function of antagonism and how to sort of stoke it.
Yeah, and then you begin by putting together a set of contradictions, as you call them.
Contrasts.
Almost.
Similar.
Actually, I got confused because some people that wrote about this book used contradictions. Obviously, those are not binaries. We got that out of the way. But
I can even D&G aren't against binaries. Interestingly enough, they call them bi-univocalizations. They say that abstract machines sort of create binaries as well. So they're not necessarily against binaries, and we could see this in, if we were to rehabilitate the work of Elizabeth Gross, interestingly. She writes about origere and the sexual difference. And so the line of sexual difference does not have to divide two moral sexes, right, in a way that would be very turfy, like trans-exclusive. In fact, the line of sexual difference could be molecular line or transversal line or some of these things that I'm sometimes critical of, but it's a way of understanding different worlds. And so I actually get this in part from Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker's book Exploit, The Theory of Networks, in which they talk about a politics of asymmetry. And in one term, it's a contrast of forms, but they're also saying that when you look at two things that are in conflict, like feminism and anti-feminism, they aren't just mirrors of the same. And we know this. I mean, this has been the big debate for the last year, are anti-fascists the same as the alt-right? And it's just obviously different. They're completely different formations. They have different belief structures. They have different motivating factors, desires, everything. So their formal constitution is different. And the reason they're in conflict, you could ostensibly call antagonism. And the way to maintain that antagonism is to make sure that they don't have formal similarity. And so part of the political project is to identify in what ways is something like anti-fascist organizing taking on the formal characteristics of the alt-right, and that's to be warded off in the same way in which D&G want to ward off the state capture.
So do you think that would answer the question of why do we need those contrasts to be there? Is this just a way of you articulating the problem, or is this also something that also gonna have to function like that indefinitely? Do we need the other in order for us to decide what is it that we are doing? Do we need that contrast to substantiate our
So you're sneaking in the dyadic pair, which is smart, but I think I get out of it. And because it's very foreign to Deleuze. He almost never writes about the other. If he brings in something like that, it's the outside, which we can put aside for this very moment. And so I have two things that sort of are motivating factors. One is just a very practical one. So being around other Deleuzean scholars. There's a tendency to describe aspects of 1,000 Plateaus according to the sort of golden mean. So they say, okay, there's striation, and then there's smooth space. The best answer is some combination of the two.
Okay.
So we shouldn't go completely for smooth space. And sometimes people narrativize that through the transition from 1,000 Plateaus or from Anti-Oedipus to 1,000 Plateaus. So 1,000 Plateaus is very strong. They say, de-stratify everything. We embrace the schizo. It seems like really ambitious.
Yeah.
And then, a number of years pass and some bad things happen. In DNG's personal context, a number of their students fell on really difficult times. And so they put in some words of caution in 1,000 Plateaus. And then so some people see the caution means, that there's just this sort of middle that needs to be found out. So one thing that I do is I say, hey, there's actually a triad here. There are three things. They're not they're not two concepts, there are three.
Yeah.
So if you do a close reading of the rhizome plateau, you'll see that there's not only trees and rhizomes, but there's also this other root-based structure that is what we would probably call like horizontality or equality. It would be very similar to, let's say, state socialism's axiom of equality or something like that. And then the rhizome is meant to be completely outside of it. Now, is the rhizome still completely outside of that? I don't know. But then in the nomadology plateaus, we also get the same sort of vision. We get two different heads of the state. We get a magician king who's authoritarian and terrible, and then we get a juris priest who's actually peaceful and merciful.
Yeah.
And you know what that is? That's liberalism. And these are the two dialectical heads of sovereignty. It goes between a liberal and an authoritarian pole. And so the nomad is completely outside. It evades either of those two categorizations. And so for me, we need to avoid the sort of dyadic, and we need to figure out something that completely gets it. And so, I do this by pulling up references from Logic of Sense, in which contrast is developed as an idea, but then also Deleuze's talking about the virtual through this Borges piece on the Garden of Forking Paths. And the idea here is that, once you take a path, it forecloses other options sometimes. And so that's what I feel like with the contrasts.
Yeah.
There are multiple potential paths, and sometimes when you take one path, it closes off others.
Yeah.
And so what I'm suggesting is we're now at a point of bifurcation. There's a path in the road, and that we should take one, and it might ultimately foreclose our ability to take the other one.
Yeah, it reminds me of Paul Demont that you have to have blind spaces when you are actually focusing your perspective. And I think when I'm reading this book, I feel like you definitely are aware of that fact. I think you definitely are aware of the risks. And maybe that's why it's darker than anything else, because it's risky, or it might lead to cataclysm. I just wanted to ask a quick question on internet, because I think that's one of the easiest ways to deliver the point. So what do you think, how did internet fail in bringing about sort of a more rhizomatic or maybe transversal sort of context, or maybe just a medium in which we can work on?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because as I'm sure you and many of your viewers are aware, that there are often these sort of like Deleuze 101 essays, and people are like, what is the rhizome? And then people are like, oh, it's the internet. You're like, oh, okay, that makes sense, because it's rhizome. So there's already work in digital studies about this. To mention the work of Galloway again, he has a book called Protocol, where it talks about how control exists after decentralization, and how our models and maps of the internet don't even really map the rhizome, or match the rhizome in the same way, or if they do, that we need to be suspicious of the rhizome. It's okay, that's all right. That's the formal constitution of the internet. And there's a more recent book that sort of goes over this sort of argument, and it's called The Prehistory of the Cloud. And it says, well, you know what, if you want to look at like a diagram of the internet, actually it follows old telephone lines, which also followed old rail lines, and so there's nothing that unique about it. Though, I mean, if you look at the distributive system, the way in which the internet actually organizes the flow of information, it's not just the sort of spoke hub model, the same way in which railway or telephone is, but there's still its physical layer is already based on that sort of certain model of distribution. But okay, that's formal stuff, and it only means so much to us. So let's actually delve into network culture or actually existing network institutions, and suddenly the picture starts to fill itself out a little bit. So the first is, there's this classic essay that if folks haven't read, it's something to go to in digital studies. It's called The Californian Ideology. It was one of the first essays published by Mute Magazine, which has become sort of popular in a bit. And they argue that, okay, for a while we always thought that the internet was a place of counterculture. And sure, it influences some counterculture. Bruce Sterling, for instance, or Neil Stephenson have these like classic essays about the internet just being a place of counterculture and hackers and all this. But really, California ideology argues that it was this odd combination of like a surfer mentality, which is the counterculture bit, but then also libertarianism. And so the like sense of freedom and liberty that we get from the internet is a weird one and a strange one and very American sometimes, and it has these really toxic consequences. And so, flash forward, so we're not just talking about the early 90s anymore, which is when, you were just on Yahoo on your Netscape navigator. Now we're going through the rise of Google and then Web 2.0. And all of the companies that come around for Web 2.0 in the mid-2000s are advocating connectivity. They say, we just need to bring people closer together through more connections. And that's a business model. It's a political model. And it's one that's being used by some of the most influential people in the world. In fact, the person who helped the CEO for Google, Eric Schmidt, write his book on connectivity was someone he met in Iraq doing reconstruction, who had made his way by having Condoleezza Rice incorporate digital culture into her diplomatic toolkit. So there are people already at the highest levels of diplomacy and politics and economics who seem to be modeling the sort of Deleuzean approach. And so then we need to start asking the tough questions. And so someone who did ask some of these tough questions, maybe about a year ago, people started talking about it, as Angela Nagel's Kill All Normies. And so she comes from this very traditional socialist approach and says, guess what? The internet was this breeding ground for anormative behavior. People got to be transgressive, people got to be weird, and you know what that is? That is fascism. That's what she said. She said weirdos are fascists, deep down. And so in some ways she was right. She did this interesting documentation of internet subcultures that not a lot of people had done, and that was becoming really like big headline-catching news. But then she has to come up with this like really dour socialism that's like in the worst ways of pro-social behavior, in the same way in which socialists who then come to power like lock people up for being queer and saying you're transgressing too much. And it's really despicable in the book. She has this like whole page long where she goes through a whole series of people's gender and sexualities that they've listed on Tumblr, and she lists it like a joke. Like, isn't it so terrible that people now on the internet are finding new forms of gender and sexual expression? It's like, oh my God, this is terrible, right? So then that's the same place that I feel with Dark Deleuze. That we're in this moment where, yes, there's been this wild proliferation of identities and subcultures and all this molecular stuff. It's in a way that is influencing politics on the highest and yet the lowest, most personal scales. What do we do about it? And so one person who I'm sort of using to sort of chart this territory right now, who I think is both really interesting, but I think is insufficient in coming up with an answer, is Paul Preciado. In particular, like Stiegler said, is a pharmacon. It's both something that benefits us, but then can be a poison. Right? So it's both a poison and a cure. But what Preciado does is he also traces the whole history of pharmacology. So the way in which we now live in a chemical era. And so that's the molecular thing. It's literally in the same way in which we think about chemicals in a chemistry sense. It started underwriting a lot of the models that we have for society. And so then you get to the pornographic side as well. And so he says that, okay, pornography, it's about these images that are meant to titillate, but that's a general logic behind, it's a cultural logic behind how all of network culture is existing right now. It's not about the libertarian idea about providing information in which you then have rational decisions decision makers and subjects who then optimize their behavior. It's about titillating, it's about exciting, it's about pushing, prodding, and motivating. So it's almost a more behavioralist take, but without all the baggage you get from behavioralism. To understand network culture is just like, it's filling into people's like deep desires for fascism, but it has this whole other sort of libidinal economy going on as well. So I don't think we need to look at libidinal economy and say, that's just for fascists. I think we need to open up sort of this deeper, darker question of where we are and where we need to go.
Yeah, and sometimes it feels kind of strange, the fact that Deleuze is interpreted so hedonistically, because if you read Anti-Oedipus, territorialization, decoding, coding, that sounds very dark. I mean, it sounds like you don't really have control over like your like sort of predetermined, trajectories for your desire or your like, capitalistic, just affairs. And but at the same time, you get to his critique of Nietzsche, you get affirmation, and you get this sort of critique of death, of like death drive that you find in Freud. But I'm leaning towards this idea that it's really hard to just purely interpret him as like a hedonistic thinker.
Absolutely. I think you're bringing up two different things here, which are really interesting. So, in part of my critique of the canon of joy, I mentioned affirmationists. So, those are people who, through a certain reading of Deleuze's, certain reading of Nietzsche, always answer in the affirmative. They stop saying no, which is interesting because if you read his Nietzsche book really carefully, he's just as critical of the people who don't know how to say no. He goes back to Nietzsche, who says that they're braying asses who only say yes, and they're only possible of vocalizing in a certain register. And so, we need to be critical of the affirmations, and there are plenty of political affirmationists out there. And I think that, for a brief digression, I think it's a misunderstanding between, let's say, three things: a metaphysics, an ethics, and a politics. And they fold all those into the metaphysics, which is one of positivity. Contrary to Hegel, and more in the way of contemporary sort of science, he doesn't believe in like an antimatter. He doesn't believe that there's like a negation that exists alongside a positivity. He thinks they're just only positivities. And this is a fairly standard sort of French structuralist position for many people. Like Foucault advocates this in his theory of language and archaeology of knowledge as well. So I'm completely fine taking on that metaphysical world and then figuring out where's the no in it. How can you still have things like negation in a positive metaphysics? Okay, so we get that. And then there's the hedonism thing. And I think you're absolutely right. Within his world, there aren't just like individuals who make decisions, who are like a strong liberal subject. And I think that that's actually where the danger zone starts getting into politically for me with Deleuze as well. There are a whole number of Deleuzians who are reading Deleuze into a political project of liberalism, explicitly. Rawls, for instance. And I don't think that's going to take us anywhere good. And in fact, as a good Marxist, I always see liberalism as, part of the bourgeois revolution that in some ways advances beyond the problems of feudalism, but is obviously the target for whatever's to come next.
So, in quoting your book, there's this place where you say that Freud claims that negation is not a necessary byproduct of consciousness, but yet it feels like negation encapsulates our ability to say no to the world as it is. And I'm thinking whether, considering, like, for example, existentialism is that like a necessity or like imperative for us to like learn how to be negative again, I guess. Is that something that you're inviting people to do? I mean, obviously, I'm not distancing that, but like existentialists, like dogma was that angst, the life, onto death. You have to be aware of the death in order for you to actually make meaning out of the life. Is negativity something that ought to be sort of disseminated in some sense?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there's this risk of Dark Deleuze being interpreted as like the moody Deleuze, right? For like goth teens to be reading in their bedroom, and I think that's part of why we need to remain connected to Deleuze's interpretation of Nietzsche, because it's meant to sort of stave that off. So in terms of the existentialist question of the relationship towards death, vis-a-vis forms of negativity, here let me give you, this is kind of a non-answer, but one version of negativity for me in saying no to the world is the idea that that's where thought occurs. So we know this in language, right? Language has this curious characteristic, not only being able to talk about things in their absence, but also talk about things that don't exist, and also talk about things in negation, in a way that, other forms of consciousness. Right? And then I'm deeply invested in a project of criticism. I think at this moment, there's a question mark of what is critique good for, and there are plenty of people coming out of the Deleuzean sort of tradition who are ready to sort of dispense with critique. Like, critique never got us anywhere. For me, I think critique is something that is about thought, and it allows us to look at the world anew, or maybe even come against the world. And so I have this concept where I look at the intolerable or the outside. And so, I've had some questions of, what do you mean by the outside, Andrew? Okay. The outside is not like a place we need to go. It's not like a utopian space of freedom. It is this moment or an event where we realize that we haven't yet been thinking, which curiously comes from Heidegger, right? And that all of the things that we created in order to try to think, in fact, are now doing us a disservice. So this comes through Deleuze's reading of Hume, where he says that the subject is nothing but their habits, particularly their habit of thought. And in fact, our habits of thought often prevent us from having to think. And so there are moments in which we understand that there's something so intolerable about the world that all forms of thinking have been insufficient. In fact, we have not yet started thinking. And so the outside starts crashing in and undoes everything that we've tried to do in order to create ourselves as subjects, in order to navigate the world, in order to be ethical or political beings. And we need to start thinking once again. And so for me, that's where the outside comes in. And is it about our own individual confrontation with that? No. But it is also about this sort of idea that there is a whole series of things that are just so reprehensible that we have no idea how we're going to fix. That all available attempts to solve are not going anywhere. Climate change is a great one, but so are things like capitalism or even racism. And that thought might be one way of starting to make progress.
That's also one contradiction or contrast that you are talking about is the cataclysmic versus molecular, which appears in the discussion of politics. And what do you mean exactly when you say that we need to obtain a new kind of cataclysm? And how will this bring about a politics that is worthy of a term communism?
Well, that's a great question. So this in part comes with my conflict with the molecular. I think one version of politics that we get from D&G can appear to be a form of incrementalism. And that you can make small changes that ultimately accumulate into something significant. So immediately incrementalism has to be sort of worried about, because that's very similar to liberalism as well as a Whigist view of history. But then, there's some people who suggest that Deleuze breaks through the reform versus revolution question. That in fact you can reform, and then reforms can also contribute to a revolutionary moment. But for them, if it still operates at the level of the micro or the molecular, both being different, but often people just sort of put them together, then you just make all these small changes and eventually something happens. And, this was the dream of post-structuralism for a while, or a certain post-structuralism when it comes to politics. That there can be this extreme difference in which transformation occurs by the little guys using different methods that suddenly means that they don't have to engage in the age-old politics of hegemony. And, I'm still deeply indebted to this in some ways. But I think that the particular way of doing it molecularly has been tried in a lot of different circumstances. They've ended somewhat poorly. So Guattari, for instance, went on a number of trips to Brazil. And there are a number of books that came out of it, The Molecular Revolution of Brazil being one of them, which is a large sort of collection of him meeting with workers' groups and queers and everything in between. And he suggests there, okay, the molecular revolution is what's going to happen, and Lula, my guy here, is going to help do it. And what happened to Lula? I mean, Lula eventually wins the presidency of Brazil, and then advances a whole neoliberal agenda. And so maybe that actually is a certain version of the molecular. Maybe it can lead to neoliberalism. And so we need to be very wary of it. So for me, okay, we've got the molecular, which in other pieces I've talked about is a monstrous transformation, where there's something that's familiar that piece by piece becomes very different and strange and monstrous. Instead, I'm interested in the cataclysm. And here, cataclysm is very similar to apocalypse, but it can also be related to the alien. And it's related to things where everything shifts. Whole metaphysical or cosmological framework. And so in that sense, it's about an encounter with something that is so strange, that is so different, that makes the whole metaphysical chain that connects everything fall apart, and it gets reconstructed, and something else will probably come in its place and reconstruct it. But it could be a completely new paradigm. And so for me, that's how I often think of communism. I mean, this is a very long discussion to have, but I wouldn't call these actually existing communist countries, like Soviet satellite states, actually communist. Because, you know, at the end of the day, I come up with a fairly traditional understanding of communism, which is an abolition of private property, cessation of class conflict, because there's no longer a dominance of classes, and, you know, a whole number of things like this, like the end of money, right? And so, are these things that were even attempted in these countries? No, not even. Yeah, and sometimes when they were attempted, somewhere like in Cambodia, it had absolutely disastrous results. And so, for me, I think we absolutely should be looking for massive transformations that could be a completely different way of life, or a different form of knowing, and all of these that would achieve those goals, and not through the sort of traditional Marxist-Leninist piecemeal policy political waves.
Well, you also have this contrast of interruption and non-production, where you talk about flows, and I wanted to ask a question about sexuality. By privileging interruption, what is the way in which we can cease alienating the subject, for example? How can we allow the desiring subject to access the means of satisfaction, which was like the slogan of the anti-Oedipus. We have to allow them to access the satisfaction. And I'm interested in, like, there's this need to dissect or to divide the identities, and that's what represents LGBTQ plus movement. And what's the role of interruption within that?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, a very traditional Freudianism would be a move towards free libido.
Yeah.
And that's when it's no longer cathected to a certain object, or within this sense of sexuality, it's no longer limited to a very specific orientation or an attempt to achieve a specific sexual aim. And so, yeah, I mean, D&G writing right after May 68 are just like, let it all go. We've really repressed ourselves for so long, and that the militant tries to make everything so serious and so dour. You know, just let it all flow and let's see where it goes, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, there's something to that. I mean, this is Marcuse's writing on liberation as well. But you know, I think that time has passed. I think that is very much within the capitalist sort of ideology these days. There's still certain normative limits to it, maybe, but I think they're thresholds rather than categories or something.
Yeah.
You know, there's an ability to be too intense or to be too extreme, but you know, what you do on your weekends for many companies doesn't seem to influence your ability to work with them during the day. And they'll sell you just about anything at this point. And so the idea of interruption is that we're no longer at a place where sexuality will or that the liberation of sexuality is really the end game. I mean, I think that the vast majority of people in queer politics these days do not have the simple sort of like repressed, liberated mentality, especially within the radical circles.
Yeah.
And so the idea of interruption is that, you need to start finding the things that are obstacles that prevent you from being able to get what you want or be what you are. I guess, I mean, that's still a little too individualistic of a framing, but it's that it's this re-engagement with the intolerable, to identify what's intolerable, and to get rid of these things that are not necessarily repressing you, but there are all these other forms of exploitation that still exist. And so I'll give you one very quick example. There's a radical group out of the Bay Area for a while called Gay Shame. And it wasn't like, let's all get together and be mired in the shame of being gay, but it's the idea that, like, we're not here to say gay pride, and it's just one more box to fill out, to be recognized and respected, to say we're a militant group of people who understand that they're wrong and bad things, and we're not here as a social group, we're here as a political group, and there are going to be some problems. And let's up the antagonism.
It's fantastic. Okay, well, having in mind that we're next to California Institute of the Arts, I just want to ask you the last question about aesthetics.
Sure.
And I think because Marx and Engels had one approach to aesthetics, Lukács had a different also approach to aesthetics, but there were a lot of theories that were trying to figure out what is the art that can drive the political agenda. And you, when you talk about aesthetics within your you discuss cinema, and you say that realism doesn't mean just sort of manifesting the reality itself, but it means to manifest the real is not accessible to the body. And so I'm interested, what does it mean? How could, for example, an artist apply your book in his or her work?
Yeah. So realism is so interesting because there's so many things that have existed in the world that have gone under the sign of realism, right? So, like, there's the realist novel, which is that, the everyday lives of people are significant and we should talk about them. There's Soviet realism or socialist realism, which are books that are like not Boy Meets Girl, but Boy Meets Tractor. Just to keep these like Stalinist musicals, right? Which are ludicrous. But by the way, there's a great documentary that you can find on it called East Side Story. And then there's the realism or the neorealism of cinema, like Italian neorealism that Deleuze writes about. And so our traditional sort of way of approaching that is that it's directors who had people who acted who were not professional actors. They're often telling the stories of everyday people, but they're also like in larger class dramas, and the role of the camera and narrative are suddenly very different in all of them. I think that's all right. I think those are interesting, but for me, I think I've heard really interesting rethinkings of realism. One of them coming from a Deleuzean who is just like, his ideas are throughout this book in a number of ways. Like, the idea of the three deaths initially came from him. And the idea of thinking cinema comes from him as well. It's Greg Flaxman, his book, Gilles Deleuze of Fabulation of Philosophy, something like that. It's just really excellent and criminally underwritten. It should be cited by everybody. And so when he writes about realism, he actually took up this debate with a contemporary Bazin scholar who said that new forms of digital animation are realism because they're realistic. And he looked at Avatar as like this realer than real sort of work. And he's like, no, that's not realism. It's not like you can trick the eye into believing that this is real.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like a production of another world that seems like contiguous with our own or something.
Yeah.
The realism in this sense is about being able to understand things about the real that we otherwise don't have access to. And so his example is the last scene or the third act from 2001: Space Odyssey. which really easy to dismiss as just like, oh, this is just some psychedelic exploration, and then maybe you go read the novel version of it to try and like crib some notes. I mean, that's at least what I did. You're like, oh, okay, but really what it is it's creating a perceptual experience that is dissimilar to our usual sensory motor apparatus. So when we experience the world as we usually do, there are a lot of things that we take for granted. This is just like how we experience it, how we come to see and know things. And so the role of this new form of realism is to provide access to other parts of the real that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. Right? And that's kind of new. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And in that way, it's not, sometimes it can be fabulation. You're actually producing that real in its perception of it. But this can be used for a whole series of social and political means as well.
Yeah.
That one little bit that I like from Maurizio Lazzarato is that he said the slogan, "Another world is possible," created the reality of the anti-globalization movement in the streets of Seattle in 1999.
Yeah.
And so, if we're to think of this artistically, aesthetically, cinematically, what we should be doing is producing these things that make new realities, but also the way that happens, the how, is by getting access to things that are real, but also, not something to be explored in like an empirical sense, but that are often events or moments where it is through that access and perception, the sort of piercing of the veil of our usual dumb human sensory motor apparatus, that suddenly there can be these new and different things. People in a crowd shouting things while they're getting tear gassed by some cops that lead to third world diplomats saying no to a trade round that makes the WTO and 1/3 of globalization come all crashing down in one moment. Yeah, it all sort of comes together.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
It's been an absolute pleasure.